pass down the 7 feasts of Leviticus. So this is based on what we discussed last Sunday on Leviticus 23 about the feast. So Dale suggested that a handout would be helpful, and I agreed. It was something I thought about. So this is kind of after the fact, but this is just a summary of the feast in Leviticus, and then kind of a chart there. The idea of the chart on the top half is you have the our months, our calendar, our months. So you see January there at the top on the blue inside, and then around that is the Israelite calendar. Okay, so just to kind of be aware, so the way this is kind of set up, it has January as the first month in our month, but you see there on the right, Nisan, I guess is how it's pronounced, is the first month on the Jewish calendar, but it's on the right. But remember that as God set it up, that was their first month of their calendar. Okay, so you see the seven feast lists there, and they're kind of frequently divided up between the spring feast and the fall feast, because there were 3 of them in the first month and then 3 of them in the 7th month. But again, just be aware when it talks about the spring feast, you see the first fruits there is in the spring feast because their harvest is in the spring, because of their time there. And then the bottom half is just kind of a summary of each feast, when it happens, and what happens on that feast. One thing that we didn't talk about with regard to these feasts is there is a heavy focus on the number 7. And so there's a lot the people study, and I know several of you have mentioned to me, interested, there's a lot of numerology in the Bible. There's a lot of numbers, symbolic numbers that mean things. And we don't always focus on that in class, but this one is a good one because I think the meaning of the number is very clear. So there's a bunch of things in Leviticus 23 that are 7. So starting with the 7 feasts, 7 annual feasts. Several of the feasts last for 7 days. The fall feast, the 3 ones are in the 7th month. The time between the first fruits and Pentecost is 49 days, which the text goes out of its way and tells us is 7 weeks times 7 weeks, so 7 times 7 for 49 days. And then on the Feast of Weeks, they offer 7 lambs, etc. So why would this text in particular focus on the number 7? I'm sorry?
It's perfect.
It's perfect, okay. I think there's something that's true, and that's frequently the case with the number 7. I think there's also something else here. Yes, one. I'm sorry? Okay, yes, that's similar idea. Perfect, complete, yes.
Complete, particularly with the concept of deity.
Okay.
Here's with the meaning that it relates, it's complete as it relates to God.
Okay, so all of that is true, and in fact, in relation to God, we talked about the fact that these were times for them to focus on God, that they weren't doing their ordinary work, so it was a time to focus on God.
I don't know if it's related to God created the world in 7 days.
Okay, I think it is. I think it is, very much so, because remember, chapter 23 starts with the Sabbath day, the weekly Sabbath, okay, that occurs on the 7th day of the week. Okay, so it talks about the Sabbath, and then it jumps into the 7 feasts immediately after that. And that's the way it happens throughout the law, that the feasts are tied to the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath on the 7th day. Okay, so the reason the Sabbath happens on the 7th day, and because of the reason you just mentioned, back in Exodus, when God instituted the Sabbath, he said, because God rested on the 7th day. And remember, as we talked about the feast, we talked about how that they are holy convocations, that almost all of them include at least 1 or more days of rest when they did not do their ordinary work within the feast. Okay, so it's tied together. It's emphasizing the 7 is emphasizing the 7th day rest. But the whole point of these feasts is to rest, to focus on God, to use that as a time of remembrance of their relationship with God. There's a symbolic there to help them in these memorials. Okay? All right, so to begin our class today, I want us to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I want us to have us read verses 1 through 12. And of course, we're going to start talking about the book of Numbers. So I want us to think about, as we read this, what this has to do with the book of Numbers and why we're reading this. All right, so 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 12. Someone like to read? Karen?
Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized, to Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our example to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in the day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the age have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.
Okay, so why would we read this section in relation to the book of Numbers?
This is what happened to the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness.
Okay, so he's listing a bunch of events here, and a number of them are including events from the wandering in the wilderness, including specifically a number of events from the book of Numbers. So, Bill.
Also, the church of Corinth had a whole fistful of problems that Paul had to deal with, and I think that he wanted to make sure that they understood just because you're wearing the Lord's name doesn't mean that you can just do anything that you want to or go your own way, so to speak, because that's what they were doing, considering a lot of things that were ordinances and commands of God.
Right, okay, so he says in verse 6 that these things took place as examples for us. So the things that happened to them are examples for us, and specifically examples for the Corinth, and examples specifically to not desire evil as they did. Alright? And then he lists several things. So what are some of the events there that happen in Numbers? If you did the reading, that was on the assignment. What are some of you would have read about all of these, Pam?
Well, one of the things I saw is it was all about the wanderings, and then I thought, well, it also talks about their rebellion and their complaints. Because they complain every time, and they complain that we have no food, we have no water. And it also talks about the death of Aaron and Miriam is in there too, because they never got to the promised land. And as we go towards the end, Moses doesn't get to go to the promised land.
Okay, yeah, all right, so there's part in there about complaining, all right, especially verse 9, it talks about we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, all right, so that's the story in Numbers 21, where they were destroyed by the serpents, and then you have the serpent up on the pole, but that's Numbers 21, that all happened because they were complaining, okay? And then you mentioned being overthrown in the wilderness. So verse 5, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. All right. So the most of them, Van and I were talking about it. Most of them means all of them except for 2, right? Okay. Joshua and Caleb. All right. So definitely most of them were overthrown. Okay, in the wilderness. All right. What else do you see? What other events do you see there? Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's interesting that it starts off with him passing through the Red Sea, which most of us consider the most magnificent miracle.
Yeah.
People could witness it. It starts with that, and they should believe.
Yeah, okay, so it starts actually with events from Exodus, okay, including passing through the Red Sea, which it calls being baptized into Moses, okay, which is fascinating language, all right, a lot we could say there, okay, but yeah, there's a few events there from Exodus talking about eating the same spiritual food, drinking the same spiritual drink, okay, drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. Now that drinking from the rock is both Exodus and in Numbers. Okay, so that could go to Exodus or Numbers. All right, what else? What other events are there? Yeah, Gene.
Well, when the golden calf, when they were acting very immorally around the worship of the golden calf.
Yeah, all right, so verse 7, the people sat down to eat and rose up drinking, rose up to play. That's a direct quote from the golden calf. All right, yes?
But also they did it when they went to the Moabites. They did that too. They did the exact same thing because they got tempted by the Moabites and they did the exact same thing.
Okay, yes. So the Moabites, and that's also in verse 8, not indulge in sexual immorality, something they did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. All right, that's a clear reference to the story with the Moabites at Baal Peor, Numbers 25. All right, and then also in verse 10, not grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. That is a reference to number 16, after Korah's rebellion and the aftermath the next day when people continued to complain and they were destroyed. All right, so he lists all these things, all these stories, and ultimately the main one, then I guess the biggest one is what he mentions in number 5, that they were overthrown in the wilderness. All right, why were they overthrown in the wilderness? Ultimately, unbelief. Sin, and what was the specific, unbelief led to a specific sin. Yes.
When they refused to enter the promised land.
Okay. So in Numbers 13 and 14, when God was leading them up to the promised land, and then the spies bringing the bad report, and ultimately, through their unbelief, their rebellion, they refused to take the land. And so that entire generation was overthrown in the wilderness. So, he's saying all those things are examples for us. That first of all, we don't desire evil as they did, we don't complain as they did, avoid sexual immorality, which they did, and ultimately all of that is leading then to verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Right? We know that phrase, but that phrase is the culmination, the therefore, to him saying, look at what happened with the Israelites. Okay? So this verse in 1 Corinthians 10 is one of several in the New Testament that refer back to these events that we're going to study in the book of Numbers as important, as instructive for us, as examples, things that we need to learn to understand it and understand, because if we think we're standing and doing well, take heed lest you fall, as Gene mentioned, because it happened to the Israelites. They were God's people, all right, and they fell, and time and again, and ultimately all of them fell. All of an entire generation fell except for 2. And so we'll read and understand it in Numbers. But the point is, we need to pay attention. We'll look at some of these other New Testament verses as we go through, but we need to pay attention because these are important events for us to learn from. And the New Testament in multiple places talks about that. Okay. Other comments on that? All right, let's begin then this morning with the word prayer. Our Almighty God, our Father, we are grateful to you for your love for us, for your guidance in our lives, for watching over us and caring for us, and we're grateful that you brought us together to study your word. We ask that you would be with us this morning, and be with us throughout our study of the book of Numbers, that we will understand you better, understand your relationship with your people, understand how to serve you, and understand sin and rebellion to avoid, and that we will grow better as servants to you for our time together studying in Christ, and we pray. Amen. Okay, so as I said, this morning is going to be an overview of the book of Numbers, kind of a preview of a few things. So before we do that, it's a good time time to go back, zoom out a little bit, and do our 17 time periods. So, let's review and just go around and we'll list the 17 time periods. So, what's the first one? Tawana. Before the flood? And what? The flood, alright, the easiest one there is. If somebody gets before the flood, everybody should get the flood after that. Alright? But then don't say after the flood. Okay, yes, there was your... Alright, scattering of the people.
Patriarchs.
The patriarchs, alright, so all of that is Genesis, and then the Exodus, alright, so the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, and then wandering in the wilderness, number 6, number 7. So that's where we are now, right? Okay? Some maybe somewhere kind of between between the Exodus and the wandering. Yes, one. Not quite. Conquering the land first. Okay? Conquering the land first, and then the judges. Alright? Okay? Then what?
Kingdom.
United kingdom. Okay, and then divided kingdom. And then Judah alone. Alright? And then captivity. Okay, so then they're all gone to captivity, and then return from captivity. Alright, and then from there. So that's the Old Testament, right? Okay, and then from there. 400 years of silence in between the Old and the New Testament, and then life of Christ, and the letters, well, no, you're right. Early church, and then the letters. Alright, good. Alright, so those are our 17 time periods that we've been working on, so good. You guys are getting those, that's good. We'll keep going back to that. Alright. Okay, so then I wanted us to think about, and I've been saying this kind of to emphasize, asking this question. When we are beginning, so we've finished the book of Leviticus and we're starting the book of Numbers. Where are the people of Israel physically located? Yeah.
By Mount Sinai?
Yes. Okay, so they're still at Mount Sinai. All right, so they've been there since Exodus. Since Exodus 19. So if we think about the timeline, overall, we've mentioned this, overall, how long are they going to be at Mount Sinai? A little over a year, okay? So, they've, at this point, basically, as you pick up in Numbers, they've been there a year, okay? But they're going to be there a little bit longer still. So, the first year, if we remember, going all the way back to Exodus, they left Egypt on the first month, the 15th day of the first month. Okay? They arrive at Sinai about 3 months, or I guess 2.5 months later, on the 4th month, the first day. Alright? So they arrive at Sinai at the beginning of the 4th month. And then for the next several days are the events that we normally think of at Mount Sinai. Alright? So God offering the covenant, and the people accept the covenant, and so Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the law, the covenant from God. Moses is up there for 40 days. Okay? And then he comes down, so 40 days, so that's going to put us into the 5th month. Okay? He comes down and sees the golden calf, right? The people have rebelled. The covenant is immediately broken. Okay? And the tablets are broken to signify the covenant is broken. And then you have Moses talking with God, and eventually God relents and reinstitutes the covenant, which means Moses has to do what? Go back for another 40 days, okay? A second time, all right? So now we're into at least the 6th month, all right? What happens the last 5 months of that first year? Okay, yes, building the tabernacle. So they gather all of the materials for the tabernacle and the furnishings and everything that goes in the tabernacle, and they build it. Okay, so they build out all the furniture and the tabernacle, so that when we come to the end of the first year, yes, okay. So we come to the end of the first year, the beginning of year 2, at the very end of Exodus chapter 40, Moses finishes the tabernacle. Right? He sets it up, and do you remember what happens when he completes it and gets it all set up? Exodus 40? Yes.
The glory of the Lord enters the tabernacle, and Moses can't go.
That's right. So the glory of the Lord comes down, fills the tabernacle, but Moses can't go in because that's God's presence is there. Okay? So then as we move into Leviticus, we see for the 7 days, the first 7 days of that second year, in Leviticus chapter 8, Moses is consecrating the priests. So remember, that's like a week-long process of consecrating the priests, purifying them, cleansing them to be ready for their work. On the 8th day, they begin their work, start offering sacrifices, and what happens?
You know the five died.
They divide who died. Okay, so that all is on the 8th day of that first year. Okay. All right. So those are all things we've talked about so far. Now, at the same time, as we come into the book of Numbers, in number 7, we find out at the same time, beginning at that first day of the first year, the leaders from each tribe are bringing gifts. Okay, and actually Dale talked about this already because it happened at the same time as when they were consecrating the priests. So for 12 days, one tribe each day brings a set of gifts. And remember, those were different things, incense and bowls and things like that the Levites, the priests would be using in their service. Okay, so that's happening at the same time. Those first 12 days. And then on the 14th day, so after that, 2 days later, they observe the Passover. All right, remember we talked about that we just talked about that in Leviticus 23. The first month, the 14th day was Passover. Okay, so they observed the Passover for the first time that second year on the 14th day. So immediately after, the priests are now working, and they brought the gifts, and so things are kind of up and running. And so what I'm trying to do is go through this chronologically, time-wise, because it's not in order based on how things are laid out in the book of Numbers. Okay, so the very beginning of the book of Numbers, Numbers 1:1 tells us that on the second month, so the first day of the second month is when they start counting the people. All right, so the first census that happens right at the beginning of the book of Numbers happens actually on the second month. Okay. Then, continuing to go forward, back to Numbers 9, on the second month, the 14th day, there is a second chance at the Passover for people who were unable to do it the first time. And why would people have been unable to do it the first time? They were unclean, or they were traveling on a long journey, couldn't make it back. God gives them a second opportunity, only for those people, not for anyone, only for those people in those circumstances. They have a second chance to take the Passover on the 14th day of the second month. Okay? And then in Numbers chapter 10, so basically a week later, 6 days later, on the second month, 20th day, the cloud lifts, and it's like, oh, we're moving. Okay? So they've been there basically for a year well, no, that's not right. It's been a year and 2 months since they left Egypt. But they've been at Mount Sinai, I guess, slightly less than a year. Does that make sense? Okay. So that helps organize it in my mind because the text jumps around a little bit in time, but you see all these things kind of happening. So a lot happens here in the first couple months of the second year. Questions about that? Does that make sense to people? It helps me anyway to think about it. Okay, so importantly, then, finally in Numbers, when we get to Numbers 10, finally the people will be moving. We've been here since Exodus chapter 19, and finally the people will be setting out and moving when we get to chapter 10. Okay. All right, so I asked you guys to think about, reading Numbers and what you know of Numbers, I asked you guys to think about themes, to think about things as you read through it, what you saw, what you thought of as repeated ideas, words, phrases. So what did you guys come up with? What did you guys see as themes from the book of Numbers? Here.
I think the biggest one was the Lord spoke to Moses, and that's at 31 times.
Okay. All right. The Lord spoke to Moses. Okay, so most of those 31 times when God's speaking to Moses is specifically going to be sections of law. Okay? So there will be a number of sections within Numbers that continue the law. And so, the law of Moses is revealed, is certainly revealed to us, but even revealed to the people of Israel over time. So over this, basically a year that they're at Mount Sinai, the law is being revealed kind of in stages, and certainly to us. So we saw some in Exodus, we saw some in Leviticus, we're going to see some more in Numbers, okay, and then we're going to see again when we get to Deuteronomy. So again, the Lord said to Moses, so God giving the law through Moses, and so in the book of Numbers, you had sections with narrative, in other words, where it's telling a story, it's telling what's going on with the people, and then mixed in with sections of law. And we'll talk about it as we go through. Those sections of law might seem random. Usually I think they're not. Usually I think they're actually related to what just happened. God is giving a specific set of laws, or repeating a specific set of laws because of something that just happened. So I don't think it's usually random. But yeah, so there's going to be some law here. It's interesting, we were, the week before camp, when we were visiting down in Bloomington Normal, he was talking about the Bible in general, but I was thinking about how it specifically applies to the law of Moses. And he was talking about when you study, that he talked about it being like the idea of chewing the cud, like the cows, and because they have multiple stomachs, and it's kind of a gross illustration, but because they have multiple stomachs, right? They eat their food and they chew it and they chew it and they chew it and then they swallow it, right? And then it comes back up and they chew it and they chew it and they chew it and they swallow it again. And I was like, that is exactly what studying the law has to be. Because we digest it more and more over time. And the first time you go through it, if this is like your first time really studying the law, there can be a lot of confusing things, and but you kind of get a sort of a base layer of understanding of some things, and then when you come back to it later, months or years or however long you come back to it, it's like, oh, and you start to see more, and you start to understand more, and it just kind of builds on itself. And that kind of has to be the way studying the law of Moses is. But there'll be more of that in Numbers. All right? What else? What else did you guys see in the book of Numbers?
Some people complain. It was like everything they did, they complained. No water, no food. We can't do this. God's not with us. Complain.
Yep. Okay, so there's a lot of complaining, and we've already seen that, but it just keeps getting worse and worse in Numbers, and it is kind of like deja vu. Okay, they're complaining again. Yeah. So.
In relationship to giving the law, I noticed that the word consumed, where God said, I will consume them, appeared several times.
Okay.
And I think that that should impress on them and on us today how important it is for us to know what God has specifically told us and the consequences if we choose not to do that.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. So the word consume. So what events in Numbers might you think of immediately if you think of consuming or God consuming? Yeah, Nadab and Abihu, right? That's what it says, is that God consumed them. All right? But, to Bill's point, that word is actually in Numbers a lot, and it's very instructive. It's very helpful for us to understand, first of all, the Nadab and Abihu event, and overall, who God is in our relationship to God. So look for that word as we study through it. Look for that word, not just related to Nadab and Abihu, but throughout. Yes?
Well, related to that, I think the whole extreme holiness of God, something that comes out to me, that God is, he's making that point continually, that he's holy and he can't be with them when they are full of sin, he has to leave.
Okay, so, all right, so God's holiness and specifically God's ability to be present with his people as a holy God. So we talked about this in Leviticus. Remember, we just mentioned when God comes and fills the temple at the end of Exodus, at the beginning of Leviticus, even Moses cannot go into the temple. All right, and so we talked about the whole point of the book of Leviticus and the giving of the law there is for how God, and his holiness, can dwell with the people who are sinful, who are unholy. All right, so these laws and regulations are related to that. So then you get to the beginning of the book of Numbers. Now that they have that law, they have that regulation, Moses is speaking to God in the tent. Okay? But that problem that continues on, again, because of the people's unholiness, and specifically related to Nadab and Abihu. Remember what God will say to Aaron. They may remember immediately after that event, God immediately speaks to Aaron, and what does he say?
Can't grieve and can't mourn.
Can't mourn.
And I'll be treated as holy.
Yes. And he says, amongst those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. Right? So there's this idea that one way or another, either you're going to treat me as holy, or else I'll make it so that I'm treated as holy. And that happens by fire. All right, we'll talk more about that, but something to think about. All right, somebody had Pam, was it? Or Carrie? Yeah.
Another one, kind of going with what we were talking about, a lot of reference to the cloud.
Okay.
Fire in the cloud.
Okay. So how God is represented by the cloud and by the fire. All right. So generally, we think of these as God when He leads the people by the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. There are also going to be times when God has something to say directly to people, to certain people, and He'll appear. It'll say He'll appear in the pillar of cloud. Will come over the tabernacle, and He has some specific things to say to specific people, and usually it's not a good thing. Okay. All right, Joel.
Question on chapter 2.
Okay.
And maybe it's just an obvious answer that's no consequence, but why the disparity of the numbers of the different tribes? I noticed in verse 9, Judah had 186,000, and all the rest are much, much less.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. All right. So there's going to be numbers. We've got numbers of people. It's going to give us specific numbers. They are not the same sizes. Okay. They are different sizes. I'm not sure there's a specific reason in every case. Some of the numbers are interesting, but to Joel's point, is it interesting that Judah's the biggest one? I think it is. Why? Yeah. We've already seen, remember we talked all the way going back to Genesis, how Judah, the person, the son, Judah, by the end of Genesis is sort of taking leadership over his brothers. And we mentioned how that continues. And Judah kind of becomes the lead tribe, and ultimately the king of David will come from Judah, etc. So we know that. But we see a little piece of that here in the Numbers, that Judah is the biggest one. Okay?
It also represents the blessing of God because
Yes.
Children are a blessing, and the more He gives you, the more you're blessed.
And goes all the way back to blessing from Jacob. Remember, Judah got kind of along with Joseph, got kind of the best blessing, right? So all these things are tied back. We'll talk more about that when we cover those chapters on Wednesday. All right. Okay. All right. Good. Any other themes that people want to mention? Things that you saw from Numbers. Okay, so one thing, so I guess a couple that I noticed as well, and this is the first one, is similar to what you said about the people complaining, that there is a constant theme of the people failing, sinning, rebelling, complaining over and over again, but that is contrasted with God's grace. So the people are just constantly rebelling, failing, but God is judging on the one hand. He doesn't accept it. It's not okay. There is judgment for it in every case. Okay? And ultimately, to the point where ultimately an entire generation can't go into the land. Okay? And when we get there, we'll see. I mean, it's incredibly devastating. I mean, God is bringing the people into the land, everything that He promised to Abraham, everything that He's been promising them since He took them out of the land of Egypt. He's ready to go. He's ready to take them into the land. And they say, no thanks. We don't think you can do it. We want to go back to Egypt. And so God says, okay, you want to go back? I'll send you the other way. And it's devastating. But even in that, ultimately, there is God's grace, because He doesn't destroy them all forever. He destroys that generation, except for the two faithful. But He still is going to keep His promises. Okay, so we just see even though there's God's judgment in there, there's also God's grace that he ends up putting up with these people and continuing his promises at all. All right, so we'll see that over and over. Second thing is Moses. And this is just something that I noticed in particular, so that I'm sure we'll talk about. But Moses and his leadership of the people, because when they complain, we know that ultimately they're complaining about God. But who are all those complaints directed at? Moses. Every single time. And Moses is the one who has saved them. He has personally been the one who entreated God on their behalf and saved them over and over again, and yet they keep going back and complaining to him. And it is an incredible study in leadership. And it is, we'll talk more about it, but just to think about Moses. And what does Numbers 12 verse 3 say about Moses? Anybody remember? Meekest, right? Yeah, he was the meekest or the most humble man in the world. And it's actually not surprising he would have to be to put up with what he does. And yet still, time and again, keep trying to do what's best for the people. One time he fails. But over and over and over again, he is trying to do it. And it's incredible. We'll talk about it. And then the third thing is, we touched about it, but Numbers is also all about going back to the promises to Abraham. All right? So, we think about the three main promises to Abraham. The land promise. Well, that's the goal of the book. Numbers is supposed to be the book where they go and take the land. And they don't, because they fail, not because God fails. They don't. But even then, by the end of the book, they're ready to go take the land again, the second generation. By the time we get to the end of the book of Numbers, they are right there, ready to go. Okay? All right, think about the promise of his descendants. And what were the promises related to his Moses' descendants? One, that they would be a nation. Okay, that kind of already happened in Exodus, and Leviticus. But what else? What would God say about Abraham's descendants? They would multiply. All right, and he used that they would be as the stars in the sky, and as the sand on the sea. Well, why is Numbers called Numbers? Because there's a bunch of them. And what is being numbered? The people. All right, so at the beginning and at the end, they take a census to number the people. And a big point there is that it's fulfilling what God said, because those numbers are huge. It might not seem like it to us, but we'll talk about it, but those numbers are huge, especially for the continent. Okay? And then the third thing is just their relationship with God. The idea, I will be their God and they will be my people when God gives the law. So again, going back to Abraham, all the promises to Abraham, and even the blessing when God told Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And remember, we saw that in the life of Abraham, how all the people around him, if they're on Abraham's side, they get blessed, and if they're not, they get a curse. The same thing kind of happens with the nation and the nations around them as we go through Numbers. We'll talk about that. All right. Okay, let me talk about this quickly. So this is a very simple outline of the book of Numbers, right? Very simple. But it's helpful in terms of geography. All right. So the first, as we kind of said already, the first 9, it's written, Moses gives the law at Sinai. So there's some law right at the beginning, the first 9 chapters, they're still at Sinai. There's some law here, but there's also Moses counting the people. There's Moses organizing the people, how they're going to camp and where, and there's going to be an order to all of this, that all that is organized in 1 through 9, and then there's some law that gets them ready to go. As we already said, then they travel. In chapter 10, the cloud gets up and moves, and they travel. They go to Kadesh Barnea, and then, as we said, at Kadesh, they're ready. God, that's kind of the staging point where God is ready to launch them into the land, but they don't do it. Okay? So that's at Kadesh. So, they fail to give the land, so there's a whole bunch more law. And again, I don't think that's random. I think it's related to what just happened with their failure to give. So 13 through 19 are some sections on law. Moses giving the law there. And then we have in chapters 20 and 21, and it's not totally that neat and tidy, but basically around verses 20 and 21, they travel to Moab. Well, what does that mean? That is the wandering for 40 years where the first generation dies. And it's not really clear this is the exact point where it starts and the exact point where it ends, but somewhere along the way, there's more rebellions and there's more traveling and people and that generation dies off. And then it tells us that's what happened. And then finally, they're at Moab. So when we say they're at Moab, that means they're on the eastern part of I've got a map here. I'll just go to that. I don't know how well you can see that. I wish it were more zoomed in. But basically, the point is, if you look at the very bottom, at Mount Sinai there, towards the southern end of the map, and you see the red line going up, the red line goes up towards Kadesh Barnea. You probably can't read that unless you're sitting up front. But and there's a couple places where Kadesh Barnea could be, but this is kind of the more accepted one. They go up to Kadesh Barnea. They refuse to take the land, and then the purple line is, we don't know entirely where they wandered. Okay, so maybe it circles around a little bit, etc. But we do know at some point they have to go around Edom in order to get up to the land. They have to go around Edom, which means they probably go all the way back down towards the Red Sea. Here it's called the Gulf of Aqaba. And then all the way back around till they get up to the north there. You can see they're on the plains of Moab. They're right across from the Jordan River. They're ready to go. And Moses gives more law there to get them ready to go into the land. And that's kind of a simple outline of the book. All right, our last 5 minutes. So that's really what I wanted to cover to kind of get us ready to have some things in mind as we go to start studying Numbers starting on Wednesday. The other thing that I mentioned that I wanted us to talk about today, because this question has kind of come up. It's come up with several of you. We talked about it in the teacher prep class, and it's a good question. And that is, as we study through the law, so this applies to, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. As we study through the law of Moses, how do we know what parts of the law of Moses apply to us? Okay, and that's the question. We've talked about it a little bit, and I said we talked about it more today. So I'll just throw that out to you for a minute. How do we know? As we're studying through the law of Moses, how do we know that we as Christians today, as followers of Christ, what parts of the law of Moses apply to us? Yes?
Go to the New Testament, compare each one and see which one.
Okay?
That's all you gotta do.
Compare it to the New Testament, yes?
And go through each one and see how it applies.
Okay, yes?
I think it also comes down to what Jesus said, that the first two laws, everything is based on those first two laws. And therefore, by doing, giving honor to God and also, treating people as you want to be treated, covers all the laws. So you don't want to steal from someone, because you don't want nobody stealing from you. You don't want, to lie to people, because you don't want people lying to you. And I think that covers pretty much everything.
Right. Good. And I agree. And it is.
I think the big thing to understand is we're no longer people trying to live purely by the law, right? Because the law, as Paul's very clear in Romans, is death. The law makes us aware that we have problems. The way we try to live is to please God. And so, we don't see this, in the New Testament, we don't see this list of these are the laws you follow, which is where we get this confused, well, what do we bring over from the Old Testament? But the idea is, a general rule of thumb that doesn't answer everything is, does this please God? And then you go and you look at the New Testament, and you see what you can find from there.
Right.
Would this thing please God? And if so, then yes, that's something you do.
Right. So, since we have a couple minutes left, I want us to look at a couple of verses. One is Hebrews 10. All right, in Hebrews chapter 10, so go ahead and turn there. And I agree with everything you've said so far. So, the point is that I believe the only consistent way to answer that question is that the only way that something from the law of Moses applies to us is if it's repeated in the new covenant. Okay? But that being said, there are principles from that covenant that apply. And the details may or may not apply the same way, but the principles do. So Jesus said, the greatest command is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second, you shall love your neighbor. Everything comes from that. So those principles are still the same, but the details under the law of Moses may look different than the details under the new law. All right? So someone read Hebrews chapter 10, verses 7 through 9. By the way, if you go back up to chapter 1, if you don't have time, if you go back up to verse 1 of chapter 10, he's talking about the law, and the law being a shadow of the good things to come. So someone read 7 through 9 for me. Hebrews 10, 7 through 9. Yeah.
Then I said, behold, I have come, and the scroll of the book, it is
not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second.
Okay. And that last phrase is the one that I really wanted us to kind of focus in on. He, that is Jesus, right? Jesus is the one who came to do the will of the Father. It tells us twice there. Jesus came to do the will of the Father. And what was the will of the Father? He takes away the first so that he can establish the second. All right? So I think of a board, a marker board, right? The old law, the law of Moses is on the marker board, and he came to take it away, and you erase it all and start all over and rewrite. Okay? That's basically what that's saying. Now, that doesn't change the fact that there are principles that apply. God is still the same God. But the law of Moses, and we've said this several times, the law of Moses was a specific law given to a specific people at a specific time. Right? As you read through it. God said to Moses to go tell the people of Israel this. Specific people at a specific time. Alright? When you come to Christ, Christ came to do the will of the Father, to take away that and establish a second. Alright? Galatians chapter 3. And I want to get through these couple verses because I think they help us out here. Galatians chapter 3, 23 through 27. Someone read that for us, Galatians 3, 23 through 27. Again, yeah.
But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor, for you are all sons of God through faith in Jesus Christ. For all who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise.
Okay, so again, he's contrasting the law of Moses to the new law, and the new law, the law of Christ, he calls the faith. Okay? The old law, he calls what? A tutor or a guardian. Alright, in other words, it's a teacher. It keeps you for a certain time. Right? But when the faith comes, verse 25, you are no longer under the tutor. Alright? So we're not under the law of Moses anymore. It's done away with, we're not under it. So the only way a law of Moses specifically applies is if it happens to also be repeated. And a lot of them are. Okay? But there's a lot of other things that people try to come up with, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago. People talk about the moral law versus the, and where does it take me? What's the word I'm looking for? The law. Yeah, the ceremonial law. Okay, so the ceremonial law is the sacrifices and the feast days and all that. People say, well, that was done away with, but the moral law was kept. Again, that may be helpful in a sense. In a large part, that tends to be true, but it's not across the board. If that's a made-up human way of looking at it. Nothing in the law of Moses says that. Nothing in the new law of Christ says that. Okay? And so that's a human way of looking at it that could be helpful, but is not the ultimate way. The ultimate, what the scriptures say is that law was done away with, and Christ brought a new law. Okay? So, I believe that studying the law is helpful. I think I've made that very clear. I think it's extremely helpful. The principles are there. They help us understand the new law. It was a tutor. It was a guardian. It did, like David said, helps us know God. God doesn't change. I believe it's valuable, but the only way to understand if something applies to us is if it's in the New Testament itself. Okay, I know there's more comments. We are past time, so I'm going to stop there. Happy to talk about that more after class. We can discuss it again in class, but we are out of time for today. So, I believe Wednesday chapters 1 and 2. 1 through 4. Yes. All right, 1 through 4 for Wednesday.